Good evening, STOCC, and welcome to this panel, which is called Let's Form a Standalone Complex. Real quick to introduce myself, my name is Jacqueline. I'm also known as Cybermedic Cosplay, and this panel is one I've done since about 2012 actually. And this panel is about the philosophy of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex. So basically, what we do is we do a full in-depth analysis of the philosophy behind this show. I include the first 2 seasons of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, which is the series that is directed by Kenji Kamiyama, since I know there's a lot of incarnations in the franchise of Ghost in the Shell, which are all amazing. Since this is a lockdown version, usually these panels are very much discussion-based, in which I basically, and this is what the panel is, I present a philosophical theory. We watch some clips from Ghost in the Shell to kind of that allude to the philosophical theory I have brought up, and then after that we talk about it and discuss it. However, since this is pre-recorded and we are in lockdown, I will be presenting all these different perspectives that are noticed in Ghost in the Shell that I have found that have been alluded to in the series, and then I have you guys kind of go home and think about it after you watch this panel. So with that being said, I'll have some contact info at the end if you guys have like any feedback, want to discuss anything, have any criticism, disagreements, whatever you want. So with that, we can get started. So really, before we get started, a little tidbit modification we had to make to this panel. So when I originally submitted it, I had live clips from the Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex series that we would watch together, we would analyze them, and then I'll quote them as needed, correct? However, unfortunately, to circumstances I cannot control, as STOCC and its amazing organizers cannot control, this video was flagged when they uploaded it for Facebook and YouTube to be broadcasted for the convention because it contained copyright material. And even though there's a fair use stuff and we're not making any money off of it, sadly, they would have to fight for those rights in court if they wanted to show this panel. Okay, well, we're not doing that because that is crazy. That is ridiculous. So, little modification. In this little lockdown version, instead, when I say during the panel, we're going to watch some clips, we'll discuss it after that. Instead of the clip, I am going to be displaying a timestamp info box, okay? And with that, it will say the season, the episode name, the episode number, and the timestamps of the clips we will be analyzing. And fortunately for us, actually, there is a legal source that you could watch Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, since I know it's not on every single streaming source, I guess you could say streaming app, right? AdultSwim.com actually has all of the episodes in full for you to stream for free. So just literally Google it, Adult Swim, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, and you can watch all of them so you can follow along with the panel. Sure, you gotta pause and you gotta go back, but that's the modification we have to make, because you know what? It's worth it, because Ghost in the Shell is awesome, philosophy is awesome, STOCC is awesome. So without further ado, let's dive in and let's form a standalone complex. So when we have Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, I always like to say that this series is a crash course for a philosophical theory that the writers and Kenji Kamiyama and everyone who's, produced, created, directed this created, okay? And that's called the Standalone Complex. And a Standalone Complex, believe it or not, has actually been referenced in philosophies before Ghost in the Shell ever existed. Now, was it called the Standalone Complex? No. It was called something completely different. However, it's referenced somewhere else, so we're going to get into that. But before we kind of do anything, the first 2 seasons of Ghost in the Shell are very, very different when it comes to presenting this philosophical theory. Now, with that being said, the first season of Ghost in the Shell really kind of makes us jump in to all of this. There's no real introduction. There is an introduction, but they kind of say, hey, this thing happened, this is what a standalone complex is. They kind of show you what it is, and at the end they say, okay, everyone, and this is what a standalone complex is defined as. And you're like, wow. I mean, I gotta say, the first time I saw this show, I was like, whoo, there's a lot going on here. And it made me want to watch it more. But in contrast to the second season of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex second gig, we really see the building of this philosophical theory, the standalone complex, literally from 0 all the way up. All right. And, you know, when analyzing these and really trying to break these down to teach and really, you know, present how these work and the deconstruction of this theory, actually, believe it or not, it's better to start with the first season and go into the second season. And I don't just say that just because of chronological order. I say this more because the first season really sets up the definition for us, and it tells us, okay, this is how it works. This is, you know, in general what you're going to expect. And then the second season says, okay, now that you know that, let's build on it. It's literally almost like a course. Like the first season, Standalone Complex 101. Second gig is 201, Solid State Society is 301, and then 2405 you could say, I guess, is 401, right? So with that being said, when we define a standalone complex, okay, the show's been out for over a decade, so spoiler alert, okay, you got your warning. A standalone complex is defined as a phenomenon in which some large event or incident inspires copycats to form, but these copycats have no originator, okay? Copycats that do not have an originator, that is a huge thing that we have to focus on. And with that, in the first season, we have the Laughing Man incident, right? And in the second season, we have the Individual 11. So, but the key here is we have to have something that does not exist, and it actually, and the thing is, these copycats, or as one of the philosophers call it, generation of models, which we'll get into in just a second, they tend to create more and more and more of themselves, and because they're copycats, right? Ghost in the Shell calls them copycats. This philosopher we're about to reference calls them generation of models. Just depends on how you want to say it, right? So the philosopher that comes to mind here, and that actually wrote about a standalone complex without calling it a standalone complex, was one by the name of Jean Baudrillard. Now, Jean Baudrillard's been thrown around a lot. He is a French philosopher. I think you could technically say that he's contemporary. I'd have to double check on my taxonomy of philosophy. But however, he writes a book called Simulacra in Simulation. And if you have watched the movie The Matrix, that's probably why that title rings a bell to you, because they directly reference it in the movie. However, we're going to take it a little different perspective than the Matrix movie does. So, but in this book, Baudrillard talks about a theory that he creates himself, and it is a word he makes, which is called a hyperreal. And a hyperreal is something that he defines as a generation of models of a real without origin or reality. And he actually calls it a phenomenon in the book, at least in the translation I'm reading, okay? And in simplified terms, it is a simple signifier which represents something that does not actually exist. It kind of sounds a lot like a standalone complex, no, it doesn't. Now, how does it work with the copycats? Well, Baudrillard covered that too, in which he talks about a radiating synthesis of combinatory models, all right? So in this quote that I'm about to read to you, it references in the book, and very, very early in the book, Baudrillard makes sure you know what real is versus what a hyperreal is. And he really does this theme throughout the book. And he starts out by defining what realism is, so you know in your head while you read this work, okay, I know what real is. Now I can compare it to the hyperreal and see how hyperreals can affect reality. And that's a big thing he gets into. Baudrillard also, you know, details like parts and times in history, battles. He talks about like this map, like in the beginning. It's kind of like interesting and odd to read at first until you really start getting into the nitty-gritty of things, but it's definitely worth a read. I highly recommend it. You can download it anywhere for free off of any almost university website. So it's very, very accessible, which is great. So this quote from Baudrillard, in which he defines real, he says, "The real is produced from miniaturized cells, matrices, memory banks, models of control, and it can be reproduced in an indefinite number of times like these. It no longer needs to be rational, because it no longer measures itself against either an ideal or negative instance. It is no longer anything but operational." Okay, now he moves into the hyperreal stuff. "In fact, it is no longer really the real, because no imaginary envelops it anymore. It is a hyperreal, produced from radiating synthesis of combinatory models in a hyperspace without atmosphere." So with that being said, Baudrillard says, okay, you know now what real is. Now I'm going to talk about hyperreals, and you need to remember what I said. Basically what he's doing. So now that we know what real is, we can trace it back to what it is. A hyperreal, we can't. we can say a hyperreal henceforth is sheltered from the imaginary, and from any distinction between the real and the imaginary, leaving room only for orbital recurrentive models for the simulated generation of differences. So that extra quote that I threw in there nonchalantly is a really, really key point. And this is why when I interpret this, it really comes out at me. Because it talks about the recurrence of models for the simulated generation of differences. So recurrence of models, that would mean recurrence of hyperreals, or per se copycats of this hyperreal. It could be interpreted as. So when we look at the Laughing Man incident, we're really seeing what exactly this incident is promoting. You know, you have this Laughing Man person, right? This super cool criminal that held Serrano at gunpoint and all that different stuff. And people basically internalize it. But it makes all of these different models. Like you see, like they show in Ghost in the Shell, you see him on a t-shirt. You see him as a representation as like a cartoon character. There's like a superhero that's like the Laughing Man. And then you have like a band that has like the logo on their stage and stuff. So you see all of these different things when even so, it represents that. And another model of the Laughing Man is basically a fake criminal that was stealing money from micro machine companies. So you see how this one hyperreal can literally be a combination or a variety of models to influence whatever it is. And that's kind of what Baudrillard gets into and how it influences society, it influences people. Now, another philosopher that talks about this a lot is one by the name of Guy Debord. Guy Debord is also a French writer, philosopher, filmmaker, activist kind of guy. And he doesn't outwardly say he has a connection with Baudrillard, but you can really tell because of the things that he says. However, Guy Debord gets into more of the societal influence of it, but that's a huge another discussion, which unfortunately we don't have time for because I only get an hour of this. So anyway, so we'll focus on Baudrillard for now. So anyway, we're going to watch a quick clip, and we're going to see the Laughing Man incident from the perspective of Mr. Serrano. He's going to tell us the story, all that the political, financial kind of stuff. And then after that, we'll talk more about the hyperreals, and then we'll kind of get into Aoi, who's our Laughing Man, right? And get into him, and we'll move on. Okay. So, as we saw from Serrano's perspective, the Laughing Man is a fictitious criminal used by Secretary General Yakushima and his team to manipulate stock prices, make money, steal money from micro machine companies, especially ones other than Serrano, and made this whole scandal, right? Well, this is where we kind of get into the introduction of copycats. Now, with copycats, one thing we have to break down is there are two types of copycats, and in the next clip, we're going to see that. But the thing to remember with this is about recurrence of models. Again, going back to that Baudrillard quote, these models, because of this hyperreal, are created in numbers, and it literally could be anybody, okay? So we're going to watch another clip, and then we're going to talk a little bit more. Okay, so we see how a lot of things after that clip come together. One, we really see, hey, we've defined a standalone complex. And two, we talk about copycats. Now here's the copycats thing, the recurrence of models. So there are two types of copycats per Aoi. There's ones with a motive and ones that do not have a motive. And the ones who do not have a motive really make this hyperreal even more hyperreal. Because of the fact their basis for what they're doing, influenced by this fake symbol, which is this hyperreal, is really based on nothing. It's super superficial. So if we go back to the beginning of the Standalone Complex series and we meet all those people after that whole purge that happened to try to assassinate the superintendent general, you know, the news guy, the police officers, you know, all those different people who were so determined and motivated to kill the superintendent general Dido, if we look at that, if you watch them very closely, at least to me, they seem very confused because what they're doing is backed by something that doesn't even exist. However, if we contrast them to Motoko and Mr. Serrano, and you could even say Aoi, but we'll leave him out of the limelight for a second, Those are copycats with a motive because of the fact they are actually actively trying to make this hyper real to figure out what is real. And as we learn in the series, they learn that it's completely fake, so it is a hyper real. However, they are using it, I guess you could say, not for just the greater good because it defines, what is your definition of good, but at the same time, they are using it for more a substantial purpose than just saying, oh, I have to become the Laughing Man because the Laughing Man. And more, Motoko's like, no, I have to find the Laughing Man because my team is investigating it. We have to see who exactly is behind it, and there is a government corruption behind it. Or like Mr. Serrano is, I want to bring down Secretary General Yakushima because, he messed me over, and I want to get him put in jail because what he's doing is illegal. So there's these two kinds of copycats, and the thing is, what makes the ones with the motive even better is because of the fact it's almost like it's negating that the hyperreal is a hyperreal. Like they're fighting for it to become real. Like becoming real. But at the same time, it's not real because it's a hyperreal. I know it's a kind of weird thing to wrap your head around, but thinking of it as if you have a motive, you're more using it for an actual purpose of how it should be, or making it in the perspective that it could be real. I guess that's another way that you can put it. But all in all, making things superficial and just saying, I'm the Laughing Man because Laughing Man this, or I want to be the Laughing Man, that's completely superficial, and it makes the hyperreal even more fake than it actually is. So I always thought that was so fascinating, and that's how I've always interpreted this when I was, when I was reading Baudrillard and comparing it to this series, at least this season of Ghost in the Shell. So in addition, in the clip, we also see another kind of key point, which is triggers in our society. Now, this is where it gets really fun, because this is where I point to you guys watching at home. Now, triggers for a standalone complex, we unfortunately don't get a definition of that from the show, but that's why it points back to us and says, okay, watcher, what do you think are triggers for a standalone complex in our society? And Aoi outwardly says in the clip, we have tons of triggers for this phenomenon to happen in, in our society. But what exactly is it? Well, one thing that I always like to say is capitalism, because capitalism ties in so much with the advancement of technology, and the advancement of technology is always constantly booming. And that's another philosophical theory that, I could get into that I don't have time to get into. We are more and more connected now than ever. So these kinds of phenomenons can start happening. Okay. And with that being said, Aoi makes a really, really good point that it could just happen. When I ask people in my panels, when I do this live in person, I always say, what is an example of standalone complex, in our society today? And a really popular one, which I like to always talk about, is the hacker group Anonymous. Because they're represented by this masked person, right? Or like that hooded kind of figure thing. But there's no real original being or person that says, I am anonymous. It's just, we are anonymous, and they do all of these different kind of crimes. They're copycats that have absolutely no originator. Another one that people bring up is Slender Man, which actually has a real big physical symbol, and a lot of these copycat things that end up happening. Now, one thing with the standalone complex is you can have copycat crimes, you could just have copycat events, doesn't matter. The key is that they don't have an originator, okay? Do we know what the originator of Slender Man was? Maybe, the artist that maybe originally drew the character, but that's almost the same way as if you said, when Aoi says, the person who could have been the real Laughing Man is the one who wrote an email document that he randomly found in the net talking about the Mirai vaccine versus Serrano Genomics' micro machines. And that caused Aoi to fall down this rabbit hole. And Motoko says, well, maybe the original Laughing Man was the one who authored it, and he's like, I guess you could put it that way. So with that being said, think back, if you can, maybe pause this and take a second, kind of critically think and just say, what are possible standalone complexes now? We have so many events, at least in, my country. I'm in the United States, so we have so many huge global events right now going on. COVID-19 is a huge one. This 2020 election is another one. The whole, big ring of crimes, with, Jeffrey Epstein's suicide, or, things, with these killer hornets or whatever. There are so many events in our society that are shaking us. What is going to actually trigger this phenomenon, or is it already being triggered? So, are we kind of in the middle of it, kind of the ground zero to the top? So that's a huge thing to think about, all right? And as I close about the first season, so we can move on to the second season, which is super fun, there's one last part of the clip that I included in this, in which is where we talk about individuality, okay, and maintaining one's individuality. And that's a huge theme in Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, because when you're in a time that everyone is so connected and synchronizing again and again and again and again, how do you know that you still are yourself, right? Especially with this whole thing with the standalone complex. And, you know, in later iterations of standalone complex, we even see, like, subconscious thought arising from these standalone complexes. Like, how does that happen? You know, and in Second Gate, they kind of alluded to a little bit, too, with the refugees, and that we're going to get to that in a little while. But with that being said, Monaco makes a really cool point in which she, you know, reflects more about how the Tachikomas probably gained a ghost was because they synchronize again and again and again. It makes them more individual because they really started gaining their own personalities and their own interests and all these different things. And everyday human curiosity is what keeps one individual, which I think is very, very interesting. You know, and that alludes a little bit to, you know, Rene Descartes, you know, the I think, therefore I am kind of stuff and all that. But it's one thing to really, really think about, and we're going to see that more as we go into the second season of Standalone Complex. Because now that we have the basis, and now that the first season has given us a basis of how Standalone Complexes work, what's the function of things, what's the definition, now we can get into more things that are complicated. So when we have the second season of Ghost in the Shell, we don't see the aftermath or years past of this phenomenon, kind of like the first season. We don't just get thrown into the middle of it. We literally see it go from 0 all the way up. We don't see the aftermath of it, but there probably wasn't a really good aftermath since, you know, we'll get to that in a little while, because it wasn't that great of a standalone complex to begin with, but we'll get into that. Or, with that being said, we also have something called an X factor, which complicates the situation. See how this is kind of more like Standalone Complex 201 versus 101, which is more of the basic stuff? So that's what kind of something we have to look forward to. So in the second season of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, we build on what we had in the first season in regards to the simplicity of it. Okay? So in the first season, you know, we learn the definition, we understand the process, how it works, but now we're going to get into something more complex in which we actually watch and learn the building of a standalone complex from 0 all the way up. And we add in something else called an X factor, which ends up being Hideo Kuze. Another difference between the first and second season of Ghost in the Shell is we actually see and meet our antagonist. He actually has a very vital role in the season. Unlike Secretary General Yakushima, who I don't even think has a speaking part in the series, and we don't even meet him until, like, the last quarter of the first season. So it's very, very different and very interesting, though. And in addition to that, we also do not see the aftermath of the standalone complex that Goda creates. And there's a reason why, and I'll get to that in a while. But one philosopher that we talk about is one named Bernard Mandeville. And he is one who wrote The Grumbling Hive, which is a poem, and The Fable of the Beast. But before we even get into that, or Bernard Mandeville, I'm going to have us watch a clip first, because I want us to see Kazundo Goda and really, really meet him, because he is such a key player in this. And the thing is, I actually absolutely love Kazundo Goda. He is one of my favorite anime villains, if not my favorite anime villain of all time. I mean, I am biased. I like Ghost in the Shell. It's my favorite anime of all time. However, with Goda, he's so smart. He's very, very intelligent. However, he just does not interpret, you know, these philosophical theories correctly, and these are the things that bring him down. Also, his inferiority complex. That's another big issue that he has too. But because of those little flaws, it makes me love him absolutely so much. So we're going to watch 2 scenes that talk about Kazundo Goda. We kind of see what's in his mind and kind of see his plan. And once we see that plan, we can then break down and bring in our next philosopher. And in addition to that, we can break down that theory and then add the attributes of the refugees, Section 9, and then bring in Hideo Kuze. Whatever. Okay. So now, after that clip, we kind of more understand what's in Kazundu Goda's mind. Kazundu Goda wants to rebuild the state because he says it's his, role now, purpose in life that he recently founded. And he brings in a philosopher, by what he says, by the name of Bernard Mandeville. And Bernard Mandeville is a Dutch modern philosopher, and there are two works that Goda references with his whole plan with this fake standalone complex that he's basically creating, which is the Individual 11. Those two works are The Grumbling Hive, which is actually a poem, and then the reflection book of it, which is actually right here, Fable of the Bees. Now, in Fable of the Bees, Mandeville basically writes a huge reflection of the poem he writes, The Grumbling Hive. And in The Grumbling Hive, Mandeville compares modern economics at his time to a beehive. And he says that what makes this grumbling hive thrive or do whatever it needs is it has a balance of two different kinds of bees. Virtue bees and vice bees, okay? And Goda directly references these, I think, different things he says. First off, let's get into the first thing he says, which is acts of creation by the name of consumption. Okay? People are synchronizing their thoughts with each other, wanting to gain individuality. Okay? And by gaining individuality, they have more of a sense of themselves, and they almost get like a self-gratification. This is who I am because this is what I've shared. A big thing with that and consuming with that is a vice of pride. And that's one thing Bernard Mandeville talks about. He says pride is a huge vice that people do. And in conclusion, when Bernard Mandeville in The Grumbling Hive, shows these two different types of bees, which is the viceful and the virtuous bees, he's in a way stating, just through the poem, subtly, that in order to have economic growth, to keep the hive grumbling and producing, right, you have to have vice, which is bad things. Liars, cheaters, people that steal. Those are the things that keep it. If you have too much virtue or virtuous bees, you're not going to have any economic growth. All right, so pride is a big thing. And that's one thing Goda touches on. The next thing is Goda wants to create the Shangri-La way of life, he says. And Moriko calls him out on it and says, isn't that a result of consumption? And Goda agrees. And the thing is, Bernard Mandeville doesn't really talk about consumption as much. He does in the sense of that it has to happen. But consumption can be seen as a vice. So people that are consuming is what's going to help the economy grow, because it's going to force more things to be made. More jobs are going to happen. More money is going to be flowing. Now, the big thing, which really links Goda to Bernard Mandeville, especially in the Fable of the Bees, is when Goda talks about the end justifying the means and basically breaking up Japan into two different types of people. You have the Japanese citizens and the refugees, in which can be easily compared to the virtuous and the viceful bees. The virtuous bees are actually the Japanese citizens. The viceful bees are the refugees. And Moriko calls out Goda in saying, are you saying that the general consensus is the people want to get rid of the refugees? Goda is trying to make this scenario in which the refugees are not wanted. So they have more of an inspiration to grow and become their own entity because, per se, quote unquote, the people don't want them there. Because of these vices and what these refugees, these viceful bees are going through, they subconsciously want a leader. There are certain personalities that are longed for, okay? And that's what Goda exactly says. Now, these personalities, these can be viceful, but they also could be virtuous. And when we get into Mandeville's quotes, Mandeville actually says, and I quote, "Too virtuous of a society results in no drive to compete with one another, stagnating economic growth." Or in Ghost in the Shell's case, a society with no, competition or strive for individuality does not cause any growth. And the thing is, also, that really flaws Goda is that he has an inferiority complex. He wants to get over this, and he thinks by misinterpreting Mandeville, because he forces all of these things to happen. He forces these vices. He doesn't let these vices and virtues really be in like a checks and balances kind of system to help the system grow, which is what Mandeville says. he just forces it on people, and it doesn't get him anywhere. And anything, he gets the tables turned on him, which is where we go into the next part of this, which is our X factor. Now, the X factor would be Hideo Kuze, and he is the personality that people long for, as per Goda, right? This is this viceful person. And if you look at Kuze, he is viceful. You know, he does salami slicing and steals money. You know, he originally was a terrorist. You know, this individual 11 virus, you know, made him try to assassinate the prime minister. And he even calls himself a simple terrorist. So he is viceful. So he is causing the growth. However, he has a very different way of thinking. And it almost seems like Goda is becoming Kuze's copycat. And Kuze is more turning the tables on Goda than vice versa, even though Goda is trying to set everything up for him so he could be a hero. Goda could produce him, get his little 15 minutes of fame, and then he can rebuild the state because he's going to try to oust Prime Minister Kayabuki. Now, the thing is, with Goda's individual 11 virus, it's very, very individualist, right? It's about you, what you are doing as an individual to help this liberation of the refugees. Now, Kuze, in a clip that we're going to watch in just a couple minutes, admits that his need to liberate the refugees from all of his experiences on the peninsula and when he was in the BKF forces, these are what caused the virus to trigger. And he was thinking in an individualist base. However, his way of thinking is actually very universalist. And this is where we get into our next philosopher, which is Hajime Nakamura. Now, Hajime Nakamura is actually a Japanese philosopher. However, he specializes in Buddhism. And he has an awesome book that I highly recommend, and it's called Ways of Thinking of Eastern Peoples, India, China, Tibet, and Japan. And in this book, he details and analyzes the evolution of Buddhist thinking over time and through different countries. To save you 500 pages of reading, what we learn is that Indian Buddhism, where things started, is very universalist. You become one with everything. Things are not individual in Indian Buddhism. Things have things that are part of everything, okay? When you reach enlightenment, there's one way to do it, and generally you go and become one with everything. And then with the Japanese version, as Hajime Nakamura says, in general, their thinking of Buddhism is you can achieve enlightenment, you have to do it yourself, it's your individual path and it's different from anyone else, and you don't go anywhere else. You stay here on this earth or this plane of where we are to achieve such a thing. So with that being said, Kuze actually has a really large universalist way of thinking. So to show that, I'm going to play a clip in which he talks to Motoko when they're trapped under the rubble at the end of second gig, in which he talks about fusing with the net. Okay, and this is where we so soon come into a war between Goda's individuality and his need for viceful kind of ways to grow to Kuze's almost virtuous, slightly viceful, because Motoko calls him out on a few things, way of universalism, and which one ends up winning this war that they're at with each other. All right, so that clip, it's one of my favorite scenes because it really shows how complex and how almost like amazing, revolutionary Kuze is. So he wants people to fuse with the net, and he wants to grasp the ghosts of people when the nuke is dropped on Dejima and bring them into the net with him, okay? And Motoko also asks him, well, how do you know you're going to maintain your individuality? And Kuze says, these people, I don't know. These people will be pioneers of a new evolution of human being, right? He doesn't know what's going to happen. What if nothing happens at all? But he's going to become one with the system, okay? Everyone kind of being together at the same place, which is really alluding a lot to Indian Buddhism, in which Hajime Nakamura talks about. And what I love about this is that in the end, because, you know, another X factor that happens is that the Tachikomas unfortunately sacrifice themselves, to save everybody from the nuke, which throws off Goda's plan, and Kuze doesn't even become a hero. However, you know, Kuze has this amazing way of thinking in which he created this revolution and ultimately wins because that happens. So, and the key with Kuze was that he was nonviolent. So again, he's taking a more virtuous stand and almost proves Bernard Mandeville wrong in his writing and Kazundo Goda wrong, because he used a more virtuous way to basically win this war, even though they weren't technically fighting in the first place, right? So, and he made more of an impact. And throughout the series, I love Kuze is always saying, we're not here to do suicide bombs. We're, the weapon we're trying to obtain is plutonium, so I can negotiate with Japan and say, I am a nuclear country, I have nukes, so now you have to see me as my own nation. He never meant to want to use them. He never ended up wanting to make this war. And he even says how he hates that the refugees internalize and don't take responsibility and do these suicide bombs. And it's funny because earlier in an episode, Motoko says how Kuze, has this motivation to rise as a dictator. And Bato automatically goes to the whole, well, is he different from Hitler? And she's like, no, he's more like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or someone, someone who's peaceful and virtuous, instead of someone more like Goda, who's more viceful and, and justifies the means. We have to bend the law in order to do what we want. So it's really interesting to see these two completely different ways of thinking go at each other and kind of see the conclusion. Who ultimately wins? I mean, Goda ends up getting killed and Kuze ends up getting killed, but one key thing with Kuze is his last words is that he'll go on ahead. Where does he go? We don't know. That's for us, the viewers, to decide. And the one thing I love about that is it's that whole allusion to universalism and one becoming with everything, and that, maybe the net is that new thing. You upload data into the net. Where does it really go? I mean, it's there, but we don't see it. We have devices that access it, but maybe that could be the future. So, and that actually brings me to the next point I wanted to talk about, in which that second gig also mentions in a completely standalone episode, kind of, from the Individual 11 case, which is about the Tachikomas. Now, thinking and remembering back with the reflections of Kuze and his universalist thinking and fusing with the net, there is a specific theory that Ghost in the Shell Sentinel Complex references in the episode called PAT, or PAT, okay? And it's a Tachikoma episode, and in the beginning, they talk about, they're debating about the Individual 11 case, because, we're not that far to the ending yet of second gig. So we're going to watch a quick clip in which the Tachikomas introduce this theory that Ghost in the Shell just talks about, it just says, and that is called the Gaia Hypothesis. And I think it is absolutely fascinating. I wanted to include it in this panel, especially since we talk about that whole universality of Hideo Kuze. So let's watch the clip. Okay, so the Tachikoma that has the really high-pitched voice that sounds like it's yelling talks about a guy named James Lovelock. And so we're going to focus on him for a little bit. And if you get a chance, look him up on YouTube. And the Gaia Hypothesis is on YouTube. It's not like, there's probably a book on it, but I actually just watched his YouTube videos of James Lovelock, who's explaining this Gaia Hypothesis. And get sack, the Tachikoma gives us a very too long, didn't watch kind of explanation for this, okay? And so, in this term, the Gaia Hypothesis is actually a proposal saying living organisms interact with inorganic surroundings in the Earth to form a self-regulating system that maintains the conditions for life to be sustained on the planet. Okay, so with this analysis from the Tachikoma, this Tachi is talking how humans are the smallest beings with consciousness, okay? But in addition, this is defended by Lovelock, and he states that a lot of events on Earth, especially things like global warming, prevention of ice ages, and all that, humans are responsible for. And from interaction with the Earth on this macro level, on this giant level, and as a collective, Ghost in the Shell uses the analogy of this Gaia Hypothesis to say that the net is actually one of the inorganic entities that humans interact with to sustain life on Earth. Now, it's really interesting because we're not just talking about, volcanoes and the soil and things that are not organic, right? We're talking about something that's, could you say it's even man-created? Man created the net. Was the net always there? So it's really kind of fascinating how Ghost in the Shell is saying, you know what? let's take this Gaia hypothesis that we know what it's defined as, but what if the net was one of those inorganic compounds that man needs? And if you really think about it, our life is revolved around the internet right now. Think about the, one's life in Ghost in the Shell, whether it's the average person or you're talking about the major, you're talking about Togo Sabato, everything is on the net. They talk to each other because of the net. They solve these cases because of the net. And seeing that as, potentially the newest inorganic being or substance that makes man survive on Earth just blows my mind. And it's absolutely fascinating. And in addition, from interacting with the Earth on this macro level as a collective, Gitz also uses this analogy to show that the net not only helps sustain human life, but it forms this collective consciousness based on the actions of humans interacting with the net. And, and that's where we get into standalone complexes. In Subtlety Society, we talk about our collective subconscious coming to life. It almost kind of like plants the seed for us to kind of thinking about that. These little subtle things that Ghost in the Shell does, always makes me so happy because I just love how they do that. And people's general consensus almost forms a subconscious, almost like this, like almost, you could maybe even say a hive mind in such a way too, just a little bit. So going back to, to the individual 11, Goda manipulated, at least trying to manipulate the general consensus of the people to knock out the refugees out of Japan. And again, creating this balance of virtues and vices, he tried to have his plan. And in addition, Hideo Kuze bringing his his balance of virtues and vices in and his universal way of thinking really overthrew him. All right. And the thing is, with this, the Tachikomas even further argue about the mind and body could actually be separable. And, we learn that their AI is actually a satellite in space. And, and they're able to determine, what actions they have that they're programmed to do and what actions they do, that they do on their own, which is like their debates and, their ways of thinking and even their, their personalities. So, and what's funny is they even start acknowledging this third self or a subconscious feelings despite being an artificial intelligence. And we know, they have developed some sort of ghost, but is it a ghost complex enough that it's like a human? Or is it lower? And this is where we kind of start getting into a theory of degrees of consciousness. And it's kind of talking about the complexity of how conscious one being is compared to another. And a big writer who actually wrote about this theory and actually inspired the title Ghost in the Shell, which was Arthur Koestler, who wrote The Ghost in the Machine. And Shino Masamune actually got the title Ghost in the Shell from that. And, this is where we get into degrees of consciousness, and this opens a whole nother open discussion and can of worms of just, breaking down the Tachikomas, breaking down consciousness, humans interacting with the net and, different general subconsciouses uprising because of this, because of, collective consciousness of people, of masses and all that. But that's another thing for another time. And unfortunately, this is where I'm going to have to end the panel. So again, like I said, I could talk about Ghost in the Shell for hours and hours and hours on end. But first of all, I really hope you enjoyed this panel. Like I said, these panels are my baby. I love doing them so much. First of all, shout out to thank you STOCC and all the organizers and staff for putting this together and giving us this opportunity and, for choosing me to be a panelist. It is an absolute honor to do this. And thank you to you, the viewer, absolutely too. You are also the people that make this possible, because I still think when I submit these panels, people are like, oh my God, this crazy lady has taken Gitz way too far. Whoa. And it's you guys that, that make this possible for me to do this, because this is one of my biggest hobbies. And that being said, if you want to talk more about Ghost in the Shell, if you want to discuss anything, tell me that I'm full of it. Any constructive criticism, if you have suggestions for philosophers we should talk about, or theories we should talk about, or works that I should read or reference, or something like that for future panels, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Cosplay. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope when you watch Ghost in the Shell again, you just maybe think about these things a little bit. So just to kind of, because that's all I want you to do, just think of it in a different way and see this and how amazing and timeless this series is, because that's what I just love giving to these panels. So again, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your convention. we really kind of see what Gota's kind of issues are and what he's trying to do. First, he has an inferiority complex, right? And the two, oh my god. Gota has an inferiority complex. That's a huge thing we learned from those two clips. The second thing is we see what's in his mind. And what's in his mind is that he wants to rebuild the state. Oh my god.